So let's talk about Republicans. Republicans are trying to make it even more difficult for you to vote. Let's take a look at the video.
The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday issued a landmark ruling. The U.S. state of Arizona may not demand voters provide physical proof they're a U.S. citizen before casting a ballot. Citizenship is a requirement for voting in U.S. federal elections. Voters must answer under penalty of perjury whether they're a citizen by checking a box, yes or no. The Supreme Court says that's ample proof of citizenship. But Arizona disagreed and demanded documents from prospective voters. Campaigners say this led to thousands of people being rejected unfairly. Arizona says its voting law was simply intended to cut down on election fraud, and it was backed by the U.S. states of Georgia, Alabama, and Kansas with similar legislation. But those opposed to the Arizona law say it was nothing more than a voter suppression tactic and are viewing the Supreme Court ruling as a victory.
Voter fraud was a huge story during the 2012 election. As you guys know, a number of states tried to pass laws that would address voter fraud. But when you really look into the statistics, you realize that voter fraud has never really been a big issue. So let me give you some of those statistics now. News 21, a Carnegie Knight investigative reporting project, found that 10 cases of alleged in-person voter impersonation happened in 2000. With 146 million registered voters in the United States, those represent about 1 for every 15 million prospective voters. There is more alleged fraud in absentee ballots and voter registration than in any other categories. The analysis shows that 491 cases of alleged absentee ballot fraud and 400 cases involving registration fraud. Requiring voters to show identification at the polls, the crux of most of the new legislation, would not have prevented those cases. And more than 46% of the reported election fraud allegations resulted in acquittals, dropped charges, or decisions not to bring charges. So as you guys know, voter fraud has never really been an issue, but it seems like Republican lawmakers continuously try to pass laws that make it even more difficult. You got to show your ID, you got to make sure that you show your proof of citizenship. But I have to say, in this particular case with Arizona asking people to show citizenship when they register to vote, it sounds kind of reasonable. Bill, what do you think?
As far as whether or not it's okay to ask for ID?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on asking people to prove citizenship when they apply or register to vote?
Well, my recollection is that I had to show some sort of proof myself when I first registered. I could be wrong, but I think every time I go, I have to show some sort of proof. I could be wrong, but I don't see anything so extraordinary about that myself.
So right now, if you register to vote,
but I think that what the problem was is that the Arizona was trying to set up a different standard than the federal standard, and I'm not sure what the difference was. But
okay, so let me explain what the standard is. If you try to register to vote federally, you promise, like basically you write under oath that you are a citizen. You don't have to show proof.
At no point do you have to show proof.
You don't show proof. No.
To register as a federal as a voter in a federal election.
In a federal election, yes.
In a federal election, you do not have to show proof. You sign under oath that you are a citizen. So obviously, if they find out that you lie, you face prosecution for that. Right. But in Arizona, they're like, well, we want more. We want to make sure that you do show proof. And as you guys saw in that video, the Supreme Court voted that that is unconstitutional. However, Scalia said that you can petition to a federal organization to make sure that they change their standards, so you do show proof of citizenship when you register to vote.
So there's a way for Arizona to get what it wants anyway.
Exactly.
Well, that's how you win elections. You whittle down the electorate through taking away the franchise until all that's left are the people who are going to vote you into office, or at least a disproportionate number of the people left are the ones who are going to vote you into office. And you do it not only when it comes to Latinos, who, because of a lot of your policies, aren't that warm on your party right now, but you also do it when it comes to blacks. For example, black males, once you're incarcerated, you can lose the franchise, which is kind of odd because you would think that you would want people to keep the franchise if their government put them in an institution, and they might want to change the laws that put them there. For example, during Prohibition, if you put me in the institution, I might want to elect politicians who are going to change the Prohibition laws. But you're telling me I can't vote now. I'm no longer a citizen. I'm no longer really an American in a significant sense. And so, yeah, this is not, it's not only there, but with the black prisoners, and in lots of ways, the effort to rig the system is unsettling.
I think that politics have consistently been about who doesn't vote as opposed to who votes. If they can keep the pool small enough, then they can always predict, who's going to win in any particular district or state. And so I'm consistently seeing that the law is, I feel like it's racist. I feel like it's totally racist. I feel like it's biased. Of course, I think that you should have to show ID and everything, but I think that the federal law already kind of states it. It's like you sign it.
But the federal law says you don't have to show ID.
Well, you don't have to show ID, but you're gonna
accept you at your word.
But exactly.
Which I don't know. This society, it seems like quite a loophole.
Well, the thing is this: if they really wanted to go after you, and you signed this document and you're not an actual citizen.
And the reality is, we have undocumented immigrants in the country right now that don't even want to go to an emergency room. They don't want to get caught. So there's no way in hell they're going to risk getting caught just to vote in the election.
Is there any statistic on who the undocumented people are voting for, like who their preference is?
Well, they're more likely to vote for Democrats, which is why you have Republicans trying to pass laws like this to ensure that minorities don't actually go to the polls.
And are there any statistics on how many undocumented people are actually voting?
There are none.
None.
Which shows you that this is kind of a non-issue, and that they just want to be. And by the way, the reason why this is actually going to have negative consequences is because how many people walk around with proof of citizenship? So it's actually going to make it much more difficult for people to register to vote. It's just creating another loophole that impacts minorities and Democrat voters.
Do have some form of ID. They don't have a citizenship, but they have a license, or they
That's
have
true,
their
but what about
ID
areas
for other things, or they have their green cards. It's very few people walking around with no ID.
Think about New York. Think about New York City. Do you really need? You don't need a driver's license in New York City.
No one in New York City is walking around without some sort of ID, because you never know when you're going to need it. And let's say you get stopped and frisked or whatever. You don't have any ID. You need ID. You cannot leave your house without ID.
But some people,
I don't know anyone who does.
I do know people who don't. Elderly people don't have ID because they don't need ID.
My grandmother leaves with her Medicare card.
That's anecdotal evidence, though. That doesn't mean anything. There are statistics out there. I don't have the statistics in front of me, unfortunately, but there are statistics out there proving that elderly people do not carry ID, do not have ID, because they simply do not need it. So, and Republicans know that. Elderly people are more likely to vote for Democrats because Democrats are more likely, although it's a little different with the Obama administration, but more likely to make sure that their Social Security and their Medicare, Medicaid is intact. So that's.
Well, as an empirical matter, from the data that you just cited, there's not much evidence of this widespread fraud for this intervention.
I'm much more concerned about the electronic ballot box fraud, because that kind of tinkering doesn't get enough attention. I think that's where the fraud is happening, because you don't know what is going on inside those boxes, who's controlling that, and it seems like wide open for some sort of
that's definitely a fair concern. But another thing I wanted to add was that a lot of college students also do not have ID. They might have their ID for their university or college that they're going to, but a lot of them live on campus. They don't need a driver's license. They don't need a state ID. So as a result, they don't go out there and get an ID until they get older.
Especially a lot of urban and like rural communities. You got a lot of folks who are coming home from prison. It costs money now to get an ID. You don't get gate money no more. It's a real challenge. I know a lot of people who have no ID.
And in any event, the real issue here is, why are we treating one group of people differently than another? If the federal election law says you don't need to present this additional identification, why are we going to let certain states say, well, we're going to impose requirements over and above those of the federal system for no identifiable evil we can point to? We don't have any big crisis of fraud going on, and it's very transparently clear that it's going to hurt a certain demographic that isn't favorable to our party, and yet we're all going to pretend that this isn't going on.
There shouldn't be two standards. The federal standard should be the one standard, and yet asking for ID is not unreasonable either. If that were if that were amended into the standard, I wouldn't have a problem.
Yeah,
I
don't have a problem.
For ID.
Yeah, so let me just clarify one thing. You know, in 2012, I didn't have a problem with people or politicians asking for IDs. But here's the thing, their timing was very, very convenient for the Republican Party. You have an election a few months out, and all of a sudden there are all these proposals for ID requirements. If you want the ID requirement, then you have to propose it years in advance, so you give enough people the opportunity to go out there and get their ID and get their proof so they can vote in the upcoming election. You can't do it a few months prior to the election. That's obviously a way to make sure that certain individuals do not get an opportunity to vote.